study again Psalm 23. We're in verse 4. Thou art with me is what we're looking at. I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. It's a life lived in the presence of God. We've seen His omnipresence. This, of course, is speaking of His gracious presence. Thou art the Lord, who is almighty, the Lord who is all-knowing, who is all-sufficient, who is righteous, long-suffering, of great mercy, the Lord who is able, the Lord who is good, the Lord who is greater, and above all, He is our shepherd. And He is the one who goes with us. He is the one who watches over us as our shepherd, cares for us, protects us, provides for us, preserves us. And David says, Thou art with me. Again, the Lord is my shepherd. Thou art with me. He's the one who makes us lie down in green pastures, leads beside the still waters, restores our soul, leads in the paths of righteousness. And David says, Thou art with me, the shepherd. He listens to his sheep. He has personal interest in each one. He instructs his sheep. He is patient. He is forbearing. He is a burden bearer. He's edifying. He's loving. And David says, Thou art with me. He is the one who wisely and skillfully in a timely manner ministers to his sheep. Thou art with me. Again, this is God's presence for us. You have the omnipresence of God, but this is God's presence for us. It is the presence of relationship. It is the presence of friendship, the presence of acceptance, the presence of His favor. It is His communing presence. It is God's provision of Himself for us. It means that God, in everything that He is accessible to us. Accessible to us as our rock, as our refuge, as our fortress, as our shield, as our shepherd, as our friend. It is the manifestation, Thou art with me, it is the manifestation of His love for us, His grace toward us, His mercy toward us, His long-suffering, and again, His care. God's provision of Himself. It is God available to us. He's above us. He's beside us. He's before us. He's behind us. He's beneath us. He's in us. And we hear David say, Thou art with me. So he's living in the reality of this fact. Thou art with me. He's in the valley of the shadow of death, and he's experiencing the valley, of course, but more importantly than that, he is experiencing the presence of God. And that overshadows the valley. And this is our life to live. Thou art with me. To live in the reality, to live in the full awareness that He is with us. Thou, me, two polar opposites. Thou art, continuous, ongoing, always the same. Thou art with me. So it's us and God. The Creator and the creature. The infinite and the finite. The Almighty and weakness. The ruler and subjects. The omniscient one and the ignorant one. Holiness and sinfulness. Worthiness and unworthiness. Thou art with me. Sufficiency and need. So it is our privilege to live in the reality of God's presence every day. God's gracious presence. To be aware every single day that He is with us. Now, to live life that way will make everything different, causes things to look different. That's the problem with so many of God's people's perspective, is it's skewed, and the reason is they do not live in awareness of God's presence. So to live in the awareness of God's presence, the reality of God's presence, is going to have an impact upon us. It's going to have an effect upon us. And all through the Scriptures, we see this impact. We see this effect of the gracious presence of God. Again, God's presence has God for us. God's presence has God. Thou art. Thou art. And again, you could go on for a long time. Thou art. But thou art with me. God's presence has God for us. So we want to consider tonight some of the blessings of the gracious presence of God. Notice in Genesis chapter 26. Genesis chapter 26. Now the blessings of God's gracious presence, it's really living in the reality of God's presence, gracious presence, that brings about these blessings. It's living in the awareness of it. In Genesis 26 and verse 3, He says, "Sojourn in this land, and I will be with thee, and will bless thee." That is, as I am with you, I will bless you. "For unto thee and unto thy seed I will give." So I will be with thee, I'll bless thee, I'll give unto thee, that is, as I'm with you, and I will perform. So God is with us. He's with us to bless us. He's with us to give. And He's with us to perform. And then in verse 4 he says, and I will make. So He's with us to bless. He's with us to give. He's with us to perform. He's with us to make. And then he goes on, will give unto thy seed all these countries. Talking about Israel going into the land of Canaan. So there's blessing in the presence of the Lord. Joseph found prosperity in God's presence. Notice in Genesis 39. Genesis 39. Verses 2 and 3. And the Lord was with Joseph. That's a common phrase in Joseph's life. The Lord was with Joseph. And he, Joseph, was a prosperous man. The reason? The Lord was with Joseph. And he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him. And the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. God was with Joseph. Joseph certainly knew that, was very aware of it, but the fact that God was with him could be seen by others as well. Verse 23. The keeper of the prison, so we've moved on from the house to the prison. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him. That is Joseph. And that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. That is, there is spiritual flourishing, living in the reality of God's gracious presence. When you live in the reality of God's presence, gracious presence, you are aware of God's gracious presence. You will not go backwards spiritually. You will flourish spiritually. God was with him and he prospered. Notice in Exodus 33, we'll move on to Moses. Exodus 33, verse 14. Again, this is not just God's gracious presence with us. It is you and I living in the reality of such, being aware of such. Exodus 33, verse 14. And he said, my presence shall go with thee, and I will give thee rest. There is rest in the known presence of God. There is spiritual rest in the awareness of God's gracious presence. Now, this is a rest of release. We are released from many things when we realize God's gracious presence. It is a rest of peace. It is a rest of contentment. When you know God's presence is with you, you will be content. You can't be anything else when you live in the awareness of His presence. Why is there so much discontentment today? Because God's people do not live in the awareness of God's gracious presence. So it's a rest of release. It's a rest of peace. It's a rest of contentment. But it's also an inward calm, an inward quietness. It's what we read in Psalm 46:10, "Be still and know that I am God." Be still. There's an inward calm, an inward quietness. Everything can be falling apart all around you. But the one who lives in the awareness of God's gracious presence, you know that God is there. You can say with David, "Thou art with me." You be calm. And there'll be an inward quietness. So there's spiritual flourishing or thriving in this known presence of God. There is rest. Move on to Joshua. In Joshua chapter 6, verse 27. In Joshua 6, verse 27. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame was noised throughout all the country because of what Joshua was able to do. His fame went throughout. There is ability that you will not find anywhere else. There is ability found in an awareness of God's presence. We are made in God's presence, we become confident, and we are made able to do whatever it is that God has called us to do. Notice in the book of Judges, chapter 2. Judges 2 and verse 18. And when the Lord raised them up judges, then the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge. There is victory in God's presence. When you know God's presence, when you live in the reality of God's presence, you will not have an attitude of defeat, but there will be an attitude of overcoming. Living in the awareness of God's presence, we overcome. We overcome the obstacles that are in the way. We overcome flesh. We overcome the world. We overcome the current of the times. In the known presence of God, there is victory, there is triumph, there is a subduing. We're able to subdue whatever gets in the way. Again, it's living in the awareness of God's presence. Moving on to Samuel, notice in 1 Samuel chapter 3. 1 Samuel chapter 3. Verse 19. And Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and did let none of his words fall to the ground. Samuel was used. The Lord, he grew physically, he grew mentally, he grew spiritually. The Lord was with him, and none of his words fell to the ground. It is in the known presence of God, the felt presence of God, the seen presence of God, that we grow spiritually. Once again, if you live in the awareness of God's presence, you're not going to go backward. You're going to grow spiritually. And when you grow spiritually, you're useful in God's service. It's living in God's presence that makes us useful in the service of the Lord. We see that David found great protection in the Lord's presence. Notice in 1 Samuel 18, so again, going right along with Psalm 23:4, because of God's protecting presence, and when you live in the reality of His protecting presence, you live in the reality of His protection, you overcome fear. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 11 and 12. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. Saul was not a bad javelin thrower. That's not the reason he missed. The reason he missed was because the Lord was with David. And Saul knew that. And that's what we read here. Saul was very well aware of that. Verse 28, and Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. His protection. So when you live in the reality, when you live in the fact that God protects me, what are you afraid of? What are you afraid of? There's no doubt. God's people get angry, but there's no doubt about it. God's people are probably more fearful than the world. They're fearful of so many things. And why is that? Well, some would say, well, it's because we know things. No, you don't know what you ought to know, which is the Lord's presence. God's presence casts away fear. Again, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. That's the reason. So he found protection. There's progress in God's known presence. Hezekiah, notice in 2 Kings chapter 18. 2 Kings 18 and verse 7. And as Obadiah was in the way, behold, I'm in 1 Kings. We went 2 Kings. 2 Kings 18. Verse 7. And the Lord was with him, that is Hezekiah, and he prospered whithersoever he went forth. And he rebelled against the king of Assyria and served him not. Hezekiah made progress. And if we live in the fact of God's presence, we live in the awareness of God's gracious presence, we will progress spiritually. Once again, we will not go back spiritually. We will not go backward spiritually. God's people go backward all the time, and then they will usually blame it on something that really is not relevant. And any time we go backward spiritually, it's no one's fault but our own. No one else is to blame. Nothing else is to blame. It's not the happenings of life. Well, if this wouldn't have happened, then I wouldn't have backslid. No, that's just not so. You would not have backslidden had you kept your heart right. And had you lived in the reality of God's presence. So you see, living in the reality of God's presence, we make progress. It may be slow at times, but you progress. The child of God is progressing spiritually. Jehoshaphat found establishment and stability in God's presence. Notice in 2 Chronicles chapter 17. 2 Chronicles 17. Again, reading with verse 3. And the Lord was with Jehoshaphat, because he walked in the first ways of his father David, and sought not unto Baalim, but sought to the Lord God of his father, and walked in his commandments, and not after the doings of Israel. Therefore, again, remember, this starts out with, and the Lord was with Jehoshaphat. Therefore, the Lord established the kingdom in his hand. And all Judah brought to Jehoshaphat presents, and he had riches and honor in abundance. God was with Jehoshaphat, and God established the kingdom firmly. There was stability in the kingdom. There was a firmness. And when one lives in the reality of God's gracious presence, there will be a steadfastness. You're not going to be blown about with every wind of doctrine. Aware of God's presence. Aware of God's presence, one becomes firm, one becomes steadfast. One has backbone when they live in the reality of the presence of God. So there's many a blessing by simply living in the awareness of God's gracious presence. The psalmist declared that in the presence of God there's joy and there's pleasure. Notice in Psalm 16. Psalm 16, verse 11. Thou wilt show me the path of life. In thy presence is fullness of joy. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. So in thy presence is fullness of joy. Remember in 1 John chapter 1, we write these things unto you that your joy might be full. And he's talking about fellowship with God. You cannot have fellowship with God apart from the presence of God. And we see here that in thy presence is fullness of joy. Yet so many of God's people are discouraged and depressed most of the time. It's because they do not live in the conscious awareness of God's presence. Now I'm quite aware that those who are discouraged most of the time, they'll have a long list of reasons why they're discouraged, but none of those are true. It's a spiritual problem. And living in God's presence, there is fullness of joy. But then notice, at thy right hand. Now that speaks of even a greater knowledge of Him. At thy right hand there are pleasures forevermore. That is, they don't run out. I don't believe that you can get depressed living in the conscious awareness of God's presence. I don't believe it's possible. What's there to be depressed about? In the presence of God. There's joy, fullness of joy. There's pleasure. There's things that delight the soul. We see that there is help in the presence of God. Psalm 46. Psalm 46, verses 1 and 2. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. So God is our refuge, and He's a present refuge. I mean, refuge doesn't do you any good if you can't get to it. If it's not present, it doesn't do any good. And God is our strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, because God is, and because of God's presence and God's help, will not we fear? And then he imagines the worst. Though the earth be removed, though the most fearful things happen, we will not fear, living in the awareness of His presence. And though the mountains be carried in the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. He is a very present help. And I like that phrase, very present. Very present. Not just a present help, but a very present help. That is, the help is more present than whatever else is present. So again, when we live in the awareness of this, there's just all of these blessings that come upon us. How does God help us? Oh, God helps us in many ways. He helps us by guiding us. He helps by making provision. He helps by consoling us. He helps by reviving us. He helps by reminding us what we need to be reminded of. He helps by delivering us. He helps by preventing us from doing what we would do left to ourselves. And on we could go. But He's a very present help. Another way that another blessing that we see in God's presence, notice in Isaiah 40, verse 31. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk and not faint. There's renewal in weakness in God's presence. There's reviving in God's presence. Once again, I do not believe that you can live in the conscious awareness of the presence of God and not be revived. When you live in the conscious awareness of His presence, there is a continual reviving that takes place. Notice in the book of Haggai, chapter 1, verses 13 and 14. Then spake Haggai, the Lord's messenger, in the Lord's message unto the people, saying, I am with you, saith the Lord. Notice the result. And the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel. Just hearing that, I am with you, saith the Lord stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel. Chapter 2, verse 4. Yet now be strong. This is God speaking to Zerubbabel. O Zerubbabel, saith the Lord, and be strong, O Joshua, son of Josedech, the high priest, and be strong, all ye the people of the land, saith the Lord, and work. For I am with you, saith the Lord of hosts. There is reviving in the known presence of God. There is confidence in God's presence. Notice in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 1. When thou goest out to battle against thine enemies, and seest horses and chariots, and a people more than thou, be not afraid of them. And here's why. For the Lord thy God is with thee, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. The very one who brought you out of Egypt. He's with you. So be confident. In spite of their chariots, in spite of their numbers, be confident. Be confident in the presence of God. There is contentment and there is assurance in the presence of God. And we'll close. Hebrews chapter 13. Verses 5 and 6. Familiar verses. Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as you have. For he hath said, it's not brother so-and-so said, it's for he hath said. That's all you need. That's all you need. I will never leave thee nor forsake thee, so that we may boldly say. So it gives us contentment and assurance. The Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me. So Psalm 23:4, I will fear no evil. We'll look at that next week. For thou art with me. It is living, and it's the life that each one of us can live, should live. It is living in the conscious awareness of God's gracious presence. It is feeling, it is knowing God's presence. It makes all the difference in the life that we live. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verses